The gate agent looked directly at Elena Voss and announced the flight was closed. Elena was still 20 feet away, her forearm crutch grinding against the polished floor, her specialized leg brace stuttering with each step. She had checked in on time. She had asked for assistance 3 separate times. What nobody in that terminal knew, not the agent who turned her away, not the supervisor who shrugged, not the passengers who watched and said nothing, was that the brace locked around Elena's left leg contained something that would bring down an entire criminal network operating inside the United States military rehabilitation system. They ignored a disabled nurse. They had no idea what they had just activated. If this story already has you locked in, stay with me until the very end, and make sure you subscribe so you never miss what happens next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The first thing Elena Voss did every morning was check the brace before she checked her phone. It was a habit she had built over 3 years, ever since the accident on the I-78 overpass outside Harlow City had taken 40% of the functional strength from her left leg and replaced it with scar tissue, titanium hardware, and a medical device she had learned to treat like a second skeleton. The brace was custom-fitted, a rigid outer shell of aerospace-grade polymer with an articulated ankle joint and a microprocessor-driven compression system that adjusted its tension depending on how she was walking. It was not cheap, it was not simple, and it was the only reason she could move through the world without a wheelchair. She strapped it on in the dark of her hotel room at 4:47 in the morning, working by feel because she had done it so many times that she no longer needed to look. The buckles went in a specific sequence: mid-shin first, then knee, then the thigh cuff. And if you skipped the sequence, the pressure distribution was off for the entire day. She had made that mistake once, in her second month of recovery, and spent 6 hours in enough pain to make her cry in a public restroom. She did not make it again. The hotel was a mid-tier chain near Vasker Falls Regional Airport, the kind of place where the hallway carpet smelled faintly of industrial cleaning fluid, and the bathroom mirror had a crack running diagonally across one corner. Elena had stayed in worse. She had spent 7 months in a Navy medical facility in Virginia where the ventilation system made a low cyclical grinding noise at 3 in the morning that nobody ever fixed. After that, a cracked mirror was nothing. She dressed methodically. Dark navy travel pants with zip pockets, a long-sleeved thermal shirt, her identification lanyard with her nursing credentials, and her VA medical card. She had learned to keep documentation accessible. People asked questions when they saw the crutch, and some of those questions were less curious than suspicious, as if a woman moving slowly through an airport must be doing something wrong. Her bag was already packed. She had done that the night before, the way she always did. Everything rolled tight and placed in order of when she would need it, with her medications in a clear TSA pouch at the very top. Elena was a trauma nurse by training and by instinct. She organized because disorganization cost people their lives. And that lesson had become so deeply embedded in her that it governed everything, even the way she folded her clothes. She took the elevator down to the lobby, settled her crutch under her right arm, and walked through the automatic doors into the pre-dawn cold. The airport was 12 minutes away. She had arranged for a rideshare the night before and confirmed it again at midnight. The driver arrived on time, a quiet man in a gray sedan who nodded when she got in and did not ask about the crutch or the brace or any of the things that strangers sometimes felt entitled to ask about. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. Vasker Falls Regional Airport was a mid-sized facility, large enough to have 3 concourses and a food court, small enough that you could still find a parking spot on a weekday. It handled regional connections and a handful of direct routes, and on a Thursday morning in late November, it was running at maybe 60% capacity. The terminal was cool and fluorescent lit, with that particular airport stillness that exists before the morning rush fills the space with bodies and noise and the smell of coffee from every vendor simultaneously. Elena had a 7:15 flight to Caldwell, where she had a connecting flight to Merritt Bay. She was visiting her younger brother Dominic, who had just had a second knee surgery and was living alone in an apartment that was not particularly accessible. She had taken 3 days off from her nursing position at Harlow City Medical Center to go help him navigate the first week of recovery. It was that simple. She was going to see her brother. She approached the check-in counter at 5:30, which gave her plenty of time. Or it should have. The agent behind the counter was a young man named Ferris. His name tag said so in capital letters, yellow on blue. And he looked at Elena's boarding pass, looked at the crutch, and then looked at her in a way that managed to communicate mild inconvenience without saying a single word. "I have a request on file for pre-boarding assistance," Elena said. "I filed it when I booked the ticket. Mobility assistance, gate to gate." Ferris typed something. Then he stopped typing. Then he typed something else. "It's not showing here," he said. "I have a confirmation email." "I understand that, but the system doesn't have a flag on your reservation. You'd need to go to the accessibility desk to re-request." Elena looked at the accessibility desk. It was on the far side of the terminal, past 2 moving walkways and a security checkpoint. "Where is it relative to security?" "On the other side. You'd have to go through security, and then... So I'd have to clear security, go to the desk, re-request assistance, and then what? How does that interact with my boarding time?" Ferris looked at her with the expression of someone who had been asked a question slightly outside the boundaries of his training. "I'd recommend going now since the line isn't too bad yet." Elena did not argue. She had learned, through experience, that arguing with frontline employees about procedural failures was a specific kind of futility. They had not created the system, they were not empowered to fix it, and the energy spent fighting them was energy she did not have to spare. She thanked him, which he did not seem to expect, and moved toward the security line. Security went fine. The brace required a secondary scan, which it always did. She had the VA documentation and the manufacturer's technical sheet in her travel folder, and she handed them over before anyone asked. The TSA officer, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes who had probably processed 100 people with medical devices, ran through it quickly and professionally. Elena was through in 11 minutes. The accessibility desk on the concourse side was staffed by a single employee who was on the phone when Elena arrived. The conversation appeared to be personal in nature. Elena stood at the desk and waited. 2 minutes passed, then 3. The employee, a woman in her 40s whose name tag read Greta, eventually ended the call and looked up. "I had a pre-boarding assistance request on my reservation that didn't transfer to the system," Elena said. "I need a gate escort and wheelchair assistance to the jet bridge." Greta pulled up the screen. "What's the flight number?" Elena gave it to her. "I can put in a request, but the gate assistance team is already assigned. It might be tight for your boarding time." "My flight board's at 6:50. "It's already 6:10. I know what time it is, that's why I'm here. Can you call ahead to the gate?" Greta looked at the phone, then at her screen, then at Elena's crutch, with an expression that was not unkind but was something close to calculating. A quick, involuntary assessment that Elena recognized as the kind of look people gave when they were deciding how much of their morning this was going to cost them. "I'll put the request in," Greta said. "Someone should meet you at the gate." "Should?" "Will. Someone will meet you." Nobody met her at the gate. Elena arrived at gate 14B at 6:31. Which was a 20-minute walk from the accessibility desk at her pace, a pace she maintained by focusing on her breathing and her gait, mechanics and refusing to acknowledge the low, steady ache building in her hip from the extended effort. The waiting area was already crowded. She found a seat near the window and sat down, putting her bag in her lap and watching the gate agent desk. There were 2 agents. One, a woman named Darby, name tag, blue lanyard, was working through a line of passengers with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. The other was younger, male, talking to a colleague near the desk partition. Elena waited until the pre-boarding announcement came. Then she stood, adjusted her crutch, and walked to the desk. "I have a mobility assistance request," she said to Darby. "I'm supposed to have gate escort and jet bridge support." Darby scanned her boarding pass. "I don't see a flag." The accessibility desk said they called it in. "When?" "About 20 minutes ago." Darby turned to the younger agent. "Did we get an assist request from ground ops for this flight?" He shrugged. "I didn't hear anything." Darby turned back to Elena with the particular facial expression of someone preparing to deliver disappointing information with as little responsibility as possible. "We didn't receive a request. You can board with general boarding, but I need jet bridge support. The incline on the jet bridge is a fall hazard without assistance. I filed for this before I booked the ticket." "I understand, but if the request wasn't received, then someone dropped the request between the accessibility desk and your gate agent system, which is not something I control. What I need is for someone to walk with me down the jet bridge so I don't fall. There was a pause. Darby looked at the line forming behind Elena. The silent calculus of it was visible on her face. The weight of the passenger queue against the weight of this particular complication. Let me see what I can do, Darby said. She did not do anything for 7 minutes. Elena stood to the side and watched as general boarding proceeded. Zone 1, Zone 2. She watched families with strollers board. She watched a man with a large carry-on that visibly exceeded the overhead bin limit board without comment. Zone 3 began. Elena went back to the desk. My zone is boarding, she said. We're working on getting someone from ground ops, Darby said without looking up. There's no one to spare? We're short-staffed this morning. I understand that, but I need… Miss? Darby looked up now, and her voice had acquired an edge. I told you we're working on it. If you'd like to take a seat… I've been standing for 30 minutes. I can't take a seat and then get up and walk the jet bridge in time. That's not how mobility impairment works. Darby's expression closed down. It was a specific kind of shutdown, not hostile exactly, but finished. The look of someone who had decided they were no longer going to engage substantively. Final boarding will begin shortly, Darby said. Please wait to the side. Zone 4 boarded. Then Zone 5. Then Darby picked up the gate phone, said something Elena couldn't hear, and hung up. She walked to Elena. I'm sorry, but we've just received closing authorization from the captain. The gate is sealed. Elena stared at her. The flight is preparing to push back. I can rebook you on the next available. I was here. I have been standing here for 40 minutes. I asked for assistance that was never provided, and now you're telling me I missed my flight because nobody did their job? I understand this is frustrating. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, I showed up on time, filed the correct request, followed every instruction I was given, and was systematically ignored until you ran out the clock. Elena's voice was steady. That was something she had worked very hard to maintain. The steadiness. Not calm, exactly, but controlled. What is the process for filing a complaint about accessibility failures? Something in Darby's posture shifted. Not guilt, necessarily, but awareness. You can speak to our customer service desk, which is, I know where it is. I'm asking if you personally are going to document what happened here. I'll note it in the system. I'd like your name for the record, Darby told her. Elena wrote it down in the small notebook she kept in her jacket pocket, the same one she had used for 8 years of nursing notes and patient observations. Darby watched her write and said nothing. Elena turned and began walking back toward the main concourse. She made it 17 feet before the brace failed. It did not fail slowly or gradually. One moment it was functioning, the microprocessor cycling through its pressure adjustments the way it always did, and the next moment the articulated ankle joint locked at an angle it should not have been able to reach, and her left leg went rigid below the knee, and the redistribution of weight threw her balance completely, and Elena went down. She hit the floor hard. Left hip, left elbow, the heel of her right hand. Her crutch clattered away from her and slid 3 feet across the polished tile. The impact was loud enough that the nearest passengers turned. For a moment, nobody moved. Elena lay on the floor of Gate 14B's boarding lane and took stock with the clinical efficiency of someone who had spent years assessing injury. Hip. Bruised, not broken, the brace had absorbed some of the lateral impact. Elbow. Road rash equivalent, minor. Hand. Stinging, no structural damage. Left leg. The brace was locked. The ankle joint pressed into a hyperextension position that was already generating real, specific pain. She needed to get upright. She needed to release the brace's emergency override and reset the microprocessor. She needed her crutch. Someone, she started. A man in a business suit stepped around her. Not over her. Around her, like she was a piece of luggage someone had left in the corridor. He did not look down. A woman with a rolling carry-on stopped, looked at Elena for approximately 2 seconds, and then looked at her watch and moved on. Can someone pass me my crutch? Elena said, louder this time. A teenage boy, maybe 16, wearing headphones that were half off one ear, walked over, picked up the crutch without any expression of concern or curiosity, and handed it to her. Here, he said. Then he walked back to his seat and put the headphone back on. She used the crutch to lever herself into a sitting position. The ankle joint of the brace was still locked. She reached for the emergency release panel on the side of the device, a small recessed button under a protective cover, and pressed it. Nothing happened. She pressed it again. The button depressed, but the joint did not release. She could feel the microprocessor attempting to cycle. There was a faint vibration in the device. But the reset was not completing. Something was wrong with the brace. Not the fall. The fall had been caused by the malfunction, not the other way around. Darby appeared at her elbow. "Ma'am, you need to move out of the boarding lane." Elena looked up at her. "I fell because my brace malfunctioned. I need a moment to—" "You're blocking the lane." "There's nobody in the lane. The flight is closed. There are ground crew who need access. I need you to move." "I understand that. I am working on getting myself upright. If someone could call for a wheelchair or medical—" "We can call a wheelchair, but you'll need to move to the side first." Elena took a breath. "The brace on my left leg is locked in hyperextension. I cannot stand on it. I need assistance getting to the side, or I need you to bring the wheelchair to me." Darby's expression had moved past impatience into something less comfortable, the specific unease of someone who realized the situation might carry consequences. She turned and spoke quietly to the younger agent, who had appeared behind her. He disappeared through the gate door. 2 ground crew members appeared from the jet bridge. They were large, efficient men who moved with the body language of people who dealt with physical problems as a job function, and they looked at Elena on the floor with straightforward assessment rather than pity or inconvenience. "Can you put weight on the right leg?" one of them asked. "Yes." "Arms around our shoulders. We'll get you to the chairs." They moved her without ceremony and without gentleness, but without roughness either, the way skilled people move an injured person, efficiently and without drama. She ended up in an airport chair near the gate windows, the brace still locked, her bag in her lap, watching the aircraft push back from the jet bridge outside. Her flight. Gone. She was trying to work the brace's manual override, a secondary system that required a specific sequence of pressure points on the outer casing, when she heard the dog. Not barking. The dog was not barking. It was a specific sound, somewhere between a whine and a low, sustained vocalization, the kind of sound a dog makes when it has located something and is communicating the fact to its handler with extreme urgency. Elena looked up. The dog was a Belgian Malinois, large, dark-coated, with the muscular compactness and alert carriage of a working animal in peak condition. It was on a lead, but barely. Every line of its body was straining toward Elena, and the handler, a tall man in civilian clothes, early 30s, with the specific kind of posture that did not come from a gym, was holding the lead with both hands and clearly surprised by what was happening. "Atlas." The man's voice was low and controlled. "Atlas, halt." The dog did not halt. It pulled steadily, without aggression, without any of the hackle-raised tension of an alert that meant danger. It pulled the way a working dog pulls when it has found what it was trained to find, with certainty and focus and the absolute conviction that the human needed to follow. The handler was being pulled directly toward Elena. He let the lead out, controlled, deliberate, and the dog closed the last 15 feet and pushed its nose directly against Elena's brace. Not her leg. The brace. The outer casing just below the knee, where the microprocessor housing was embedded. The dog sat. In working dog language, a sit was a final indication. It meant, here, this. The handler stood above Elena and looked at his dog. Then he looked at the brace. Then he looked at Elena with an expression that had moved very far from whatever expression he'd started the morning with. "I'm sorry," he said. "That's never happened before. He's trained for—" He stopped. He crouched down, eye level with the brace, and looked at the housing where the dog had indicated. Elena watched his face change. "Where did you get this brace?" he said. "It was fitted through a veteran rehabilitation program about 8 months ago." "Which program?" She told him. Something moved through his expression, recognition, or something colder than recognition. "My name is Mason Riker," he said. "I'm with Naval Special Warfare, and I think I need you to tell me exactly how you ended up with this device, because what my dog just indicated on—" He stopped again, and when he looked up at her, there was something in his eyes that was not confusion anymore. It was controlled urgency, the kind that belongs to people who have spent time in situations where information is the difference between recovery and catastrophe. "What my dog just indicated on is not a medical component." Elena looked down at the brace locked around her leg. At the microprocessor housing she had pressed and pressed without result. At the device she had worn for 8 months without question, because the program coordinator had been professional and the equipment had been provided through what she had believed were legitimate VA channels. "What is it?" she said. Mason's jaw tightened. "It's a military-grade transmitter," he said. "And based on the signal signature Atlas is responding to, I know exactly who put it there." Through the gate window behind them, the aircraft taxied slowly toward the runway. The terminal hum continued. Somewhere near the food court, someone's coffee order was announced over a speaker. Elena Voss sat in an airport chair with a locked brace, a bruised hip, and a transmitter she had been carrying in her leg for 8 months. And the man crouching beside her had gone very still, in the way that people only go still when they have just found something they had stopped believing they would ever find. "Who?" she said. Mason looked at her. His hand moved to the communications device clipped to his jacket. "Someone who's been missing," he said, "for a very long time." Mason did not make the call standing in the open concourse. He stood, looked once at the gate windows, at the aircraft now rolling steadily toward the far end of the tarmac, and made a decision Elena could see forming on his face before he acted on it. A rapid, sequential calculation that compressed several questions into one movement. He unclipped the communications device from his jacket, pressed a button, and said 3 words into it. "Atlas has indicated." Then he clipped it back, looked at Elena, and said, "Can you walk if I support the left side?" "The joint is still locked." "I know. I'm not asking you to use it. I'm asking if you can move." She understood the distinction. "Yes." "Then we need to get away from this gate." Elena did not ask why. She had spent enough time around people who operated in high-stakes environments, trauma surgeons, paramedics, field commanders rotating through her ward, to recognize when someone's tone had shifted from conversational to operational. Mason's tone had made that shift somewhere between military-grade transmitter and right now, and it was not a shift that invited clarification. It invited compliance, at least temporarily, and Elena Voss was not a person who complied with things she didn't understand, but she was a person who could read a room. She reached for her crutch. Mason was already positioned on her left, his hand at her elbow. Not gripping, just present, available. And Atlas moved to her right side with the calm authority of a dog that understood his job included more than detection. They moved down the concourse. "You said someone missing," Elena said, keeping her voice low. The airport noise around them was sufficient cover. Rolling luggage, gate announcements, the background roar of an HVAC system that needed maintenance. But old habit made her quiet. "Captain Adrian Solt," Mason said. "Navy. He went into a veteran rehabilitation program 11 months ago for a shoulder injury and a TBI evaluation. 73 days later, the program reported he had voluntarily discharged himself and relocated. His family couldn't reach him. His commanding officer filed a concern report. Naval Criminal Investigative Service looked at it for 2 weeks and closed it as a wellness matter. But Adrian would not have discharged voluntarily in the middle of a TBI protocol. He had 3 more weeks of mandatory evaluation, and the last message he sent me, 4 days before he disappeared, said he had found something in the program's records that he wasn't supposed to find." Elena processed this without speaking for a moment. The brace was forcing her gait into an awkward compensation pattern. Right leg taking most of the load, crutch providing stability, left leg dragging in a locked forward position that was going to leave her significantly sore by tomorrow. She was already categorizing the physiological consequences with the automatic triage reflex that her nursing brain applied to everything. "The program that fitted this brace," she said. "Tell me if the name matches." She told him. Mason's jaw set in a way that answered the question before he spoke. "Silver Meridian Veteran Recovery Services," he said. "That's the one. They had a contract with the VA facility that was managing my rehabilitation. My orthopedic coordinator referred me. Everything went through proper channels. I had no reason to question it." "I know. I'm not suggesting you did anything wrong. I didn't say you were. I'm establishing the sequence so we're both working from the same information." She glanced at him sideways. "How long have you been looking for Adrian Solt?" 8 months? The same 8 months the brace had been on her leg. They had reached a quieter section of the concourse, near a closed gate at the end of a wing that wasn't seeing morning traffic. Mason guided them to a cluster of chairs set apart from the main flow, and Elena sat down with the specific deliberateness of someone whose body had been through something and was managing the aftermath. Atlas settled at her feet. The dog had not taken his attention off the brace. Mason crouched in front of her and looked at the device with the careful attention of a man who was trying to see something he couldn't fully see yet. "Can I touch the casing? It's on my leg." "I know. I'll be careful." She nodded. His hands were steady. I examined the section of the outer housing just below the knee, the section Atlas had indicated, running his thumb along the seam between two panels of the polymer casing. Elena watched his face rather than his hands, and saw the moment he found what he was looking for. His breathing changed. Nothing dramatic, just a slight deceleration, the kind that happens when tension is replaced by something colder. "There's a secondary housing inside this panel," he said. "It's not part of the standard medical device schematics. It's been integrated into the casing without interrupting the primary function, which is why it didn't trigger any equipment flags." He looked up at her. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. This isn't improvised." "How did Atlas know to indicate on it?" "Adrian trained with Atlas for 2 years. The transmitter is running on a frequency that Atlas was specifically conditioned to detect. It was part of a search protocol we used in a recovery operation 2 years ago. If Adrian built this device or modified this brace, he would have known exactly what frequency to use." Mason was quiet for a moment. "He left a trail. He put the trail into a device that would be given to a patient, knowing the patient would travel eventually, knowing that if Atlas was ever within range, he was counting on a Belgian Malinois being in an airport. He was counting on me being in this airport. I'm based out of Vasker Falls Naval Station. This is the closest commercial airport. Any flight I take commercially goes through here." Mason's voice was even, but there was something underneath it, something that had been held under pressure for 8 months and was only now finding the edge of release. "He knew I would come through here eventually. He just needed the patient to be here at the same time." Elena stared at the brace, at the locked joint she had been fighting with for the last 40 minutes, at the device she had strapped on in the dark at 4:47 that morning without any knowledge of what she was carrying. "He used me," she said. "It was not an accusation. It was a fact," stated flatly. "He used your brace. I don't think he knew who you were." "Does that distinction matter if I've been carrying a transmitter through security checkpoints for 8 months? Mason didn't answer immediately, and she gave him credit for that. A lesser person would have reached for reassurance. He sat with the honest difficulty of the question. "No," he said finally. "Probably not. If someone at Silver Meridian identified the transmitter, you would have been in danger regardless of your connection to Adrian." The word landed in the space between them. Danger. Elena had spent 4 years as a Navy trauma nurse and another 3 years as a civilian trauma nurse at a Level 1 center. She was not unfamiliar with the concept of danger, but there was a specific quality to this particular version of it: retroactive danger. The kind that revealed itself after the fact and forced you to re-examine everything you had believed was ordinary, that sat differently in the stomach than the immediate visible dangers she was trained to manage. "What's on the transmitter?" she said. "I don't know yet. I need someone with the right equipment to extract the data without destroying it. But based on what Adrian told me before he disappeared..." Mason reached into his jacket and pulled out a phone, unlocking it and pulling up a photograph. "This is the last message he sent me." Elena looked at the screen. The message was short. "Records falsified. Equipment redirected. People inside. Don't let them close this." As she read it twice. Then she looked at Mason. "Records falsified in what context?" "Patient records. Veterans in the program. Adrian believed Silver Meridian was manipulating patient documentation to extend program enrollment beyond medical necessity, which would allow them to retain equipment allocations, mobility devices, adaptive technology, rehabilitation gear, beyond what patients actually needed. The equipment was going somewhere. He was trying to find out where. And then he disappeared. And then he disappeared." Elena was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the airport continued its morning rhythms. A gate announcement for a flight to the coast, the mechanical clunk of a jet bridge connecting somewhere down the concourse, a child crying briefly and then stopping. Normal things. She was sitting inside all of them with a locked brace and a hidden transmitter, and a picture that was becoming very clear very fast. "You need to contact NCIS," she said. "I need to contact people I trust inside NCIS. Those are not the same population." His voice was dry in a way that suggested experience. The first report on Adrian was closed fast, faster than a routine wellness follow-up should close. Someone either didn't look carefully or didn't want to. "How long until your backup gets here?" 20 minutes, maybe less. "Then I have a question while we wait." "Go ahead." "The airline staff," Elena said, "they're going to come looking for me. I filed a complaint before I fell, and then I fell in front of multiple witnesses, and right now the ground crew who moved me is probably filling out an incident report. When your people arrive, this area is going to get complicated." Mason looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between assessment and something that might have been, under different circumstances, amusement. "You're thinking about incident management." "I'm a trauma nurse. I always think about incident management." "What's your suggestion?" "Call your backup now and tell them to make contact through the airport operations office, rather than walking the concourse in whatever they're wearing. If Silver Meridian has people watching this program, and based on what you just told me, they might... A cluster of federal types appearing at Gate 14B is going to telegraph exactly what we have." She looked at the brace. "And I need someone who can release this joint without damaging the transmitter housing. I don't know what's in there, but if it's evidence, I'm not letting an airport EMT crack it open to free my leg." Mason looked at her for a moment longer than was necessary. Then he reached for his communications device. "What's your name?" he said. Not as if he didn't remember, as if he was realizing he should have asked sooner. "Elena Voss, former Navy, trauma nursing, Harlow City Medical Center." He nodded, keyed the device. "This is Riker. Change the approach vector. Come in through airport operations. Bring a technical asset. I need a non-destructive extraction from a sealed medical housing." A pause. "And tell Hargrove I need the Silver Meridian file on his screen before he walks in the door." He released the button and looked at Elena. 20 minutes, he said. "Then I want to know everything you know about Adrian Solt and what he found." Mason settled into the chair beside her. Atlas had not moved from his position near the brace. Outside the terminal windows, the sky was beginning to lighten toward pale gray, the kind of November morning that never fully committed to daylight. Mason talked. Elena listened. Adrian Solt had entered Silver Meridian's program 14 months ago through a referral from his base physician, a routine pathway for veterans with documented injuries requiring extended rehabilitation. The program was licensed and VA affiliated, with a clean compliance record and strong reviews. On paper, it was exactly what it advertised: a bridge between acute military medical care and long-term civilian adaptive living, specializing in mobility restoration for veterans with musculoskeletal injuries. What Adrian had found, in his 9th week in the program, was a discrepancy in the equipment logs. Specifically, 3 mobility devices had been issued to a patient named Warwick Holt, a veteran with a spinal compression injury requiring a motorized wheelchair and 2 specialized orthotic braces. The devices were logged as issued, meaning they left the program's inventory and were charged against the VA's equipment fund. But Warwick Holt, when Adrian had casually checked in on the man 2 weeks later during a shared therapy session, was using none of them. When Adrian asked Warwick about the equipment, Warwick looked at him with the specific expression of someone who had been told not to discuss something and was uncertain whether discussing it anyway would have consequences. "He said the coordinator took them back," Mason said. "Told him they were a different model than what his prescription required. But no exchange was ever logged. The original devices were marked as issued and in use. They just weren't. Where were they?" That's what Adrian was trying to find out when they closed his program enrollment. Mason's hands were still. He was not someone who gestured when he spoke, Elena noted. He communicated with precision and economy, which was either training or temperament, probably both. His discharge paperwork was filed 6 days after he started asking questions about the equipment logs, filed by a program administrator named Lorraine Veth. He was processed out within 48 hours. And nobody flagged that as unusual. The program said he'd chosen to leave voluntarily. His signature was on the paperwork. Was it his signature? Mason's expression answered that. Elena stared at the middle distance. The clinical part of her brain was mapping it, the structure of what was being described, the infrastructure it would require. Not just falsifying a single patient record, falsifying records at a systemic level. moving equipment out of program inventory while maintaining the paper fiction that the equipment was in patient use, the VA budget allocations, the licensing compliance reviews, the auditing mechanisms. All of it would have to have been managed, which meant people, multiple people, not a freelance operation. "How much equipment are we talking about?" she said. "We don't know. The transmitter might tell us." A noise at the far end of the concourse pulled both their attention. Not dramatic, just footsteps at a pace that did not quite match the ambient airport rhythm. Elena looked without turning her head, using the reflection in the window. Two men in business casual clothing were walking the concourse in the direction of their gate wing, moving with the practiced ease of people who did not want to look like they were moving with purpose. One was carrying a phone at an angle that would let him film what was in front of him without appearing to film it. Elena said quietly, "We have company." Mason had already seen them. His hand moved to Atlas's collar. Not the lead, just the collar, a contact that settled the dog without restraining him. "Describe the one on the left." 5'10", navy jacket, phone at chest height. He's angled toward us. "And the other one?" "Bigger, staying half a step behind, watching the exits." Mason keyed his comm device without raising his voice. "Riker, I have 2 possible surveillance assets approaching my position from the northeast corridor. Where's my backup?" He listened. "How long?" He listened again, and Elena could not hear the response, but she could read the fractional tightening around his eyes. "Copy." He looked at her. 12 minutes. "And these two?" 2 minutes, at their current pace. "Options?" "We can move, but you can't move fast." "I know that." She looked at the brace, at the locked joint, at the device she had been wearing for 8 months. "Can Atlas work off lead?" Mason looked at her carefully. "Why?" "Because a large working dog moving freely in an airport terminal is going to redirect a lot of attention. Security will respond. Security response means cameras, staff, official presence, all of which creates a buffer." She met his eyes. "And it buys you 12 minutes without requiring me to walk." He was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "Atlas." His voice dropped to a register Elena felt more than heard. The dog's ears moved. "Perimeter." Atlas stood, moved away from Elena's feet, and began a slow, deliberate circuit of the gate area. Not running, not alarmed, just moving with the focused intentionality of a trained working animal performing a task. Within 60 seconds, 2 TSA officers appeared from the main concourse. Within 90, the 2 men in business casual had slowed. The one with the phone had lowered it. The buffer held. But the man in the navy jacket did not leave. He positioned himself near a row of chairs at the edge of the gate area and sat down with the particular stillness of someone who had decided to wait out the interference. His colleague drifted to the food kiosk at the corridor junction. They were not leaving. They were adjusting. Elena looked at the brace again. At the panel Mason had identified. At the evidence locked inside a device that had been on her body for 8 months. Evidence that someone had worked very hard to keep concealed. Evidence that a man named Adrian Solt had apparently decided was worth whatever it cost him to hide it. She thought about what it meant to carry something without knowing you were carrying it. To be a vessel for someone else's desperate plan, selected not because you were important to anyone, but because you were going somewhere, because you used an airport, because eventually proximity and probability would do what human planning couldn't. It made her tired in a way that was different from physical exhaustion. Then it made her angry. Not at Adrian Solt, who had been desperate and cornered and doing what people in those situations do, using whatever resource was available, but at Silver Meridian, at Lorraine Veth and the people behind her, at the entire architecture of exploitation they had built on the assumption that disabled veterans were manageable, documentable, forgettable. That a man with a TBI and a shoulder injury could be shuffled out of a program and nobody would push hard enough to find out why. That a nurse with a mobility brace could be ignored in an airport until she fell on the floor, and even then the primary concern would be clearing the boarding lane. "Tell me about the complaint process," she said. Mason glanced at her. "What?" "The airline. Darby. The gate agent. I filed a verbal complaint before I fell, and I have her name, the time, and the sequence of events documented in my notebook." She held up the small notebook. "When your people get here, I need someone to interface with airport operations about the accessibility failure, separately from the transmitter issue. You want to file a complaint right now? I want the record made while the evidence is fresh. The security footage will show how long I waited, how many people were in that boarding lane, and exactly what happened when the brace failed. If I don't make that record today, it disappears. She looked at him evenly. The transmitter is your problem to handle. The way those agents treated me today is mine. Mason studied her. In his expression, there was something Elena had not seen since she was in uniform. The specific regard of someone who had revised their assessment of a person mid-conversation and was acknowledging the revision without making a production of it. I'll add it to the operations contact, he said. The man in the navy jacket stood up. Elena watched in the window reflection as the man moved toward the corridor junction, stopped near his colleague at the kiosk, and spoke briefly. The colleague looked at his phone. Then both men looked directly at the gate area. Not at Mason, not at the circling dog. At Elena. The specific focus of it, two men, at the same moment, orienting their attention to the woman in the chair with the locked brace, clarified something that had been forming at the edges of Elena's understanding since Mason had said the word danger. They were not surveillance, or not only surveillance, they knew what was in the brace. Mason, she said, keeping her voice flat and even. He had already seen it. He was already on the comm device. Riker, move it up, now. Atlas came back from his circuit and sat directly in front of Elena, between her and the corridor, between her and the two men who were no longer pretending to be incidental. And the dog's entire posture had changed. No hackles, no sound, just presence, dense and absolute and pointed in exactly the right direction. The man in the navy jacket reached into his jacket, and the first federal badge appeared at the corridor entrance behind him, not walking, moving. Two people in civilian clothes with the unmistakable carriage of authority arriving with intention, ID already in hand, eyes already on the situation with the comprehensive attention of people who had been briefed in transit and arrived knowing exactly what they were walking into. The man in the navy jacket's hand stopped inside his jacket. I was doing the same calculation Elena had been doing. The geometry of the moment, the number of people, the presence of the dog, the cameras, the arriving federal agents, and whatever he found in that calculation made him very slowly withdraw his empty hand. His colleague at the kiosk turned and walked away. Not running. Just walking, with the careful, deliberate pace of a man who had decided to be somewhere else before any of this became a matter of formal record. The federal agents let him go. For now. One of them reached Mason and spoke quietly. Mason listened, nodded twice, and then looked at Elena with an expression that had moved fully into the territory of controlled urgency. We need to move you to a secure operations room, he said. Right now. What's happened? He crouched, met her eye level, and his voice dropped to something she had to lean forward to catch. The file Hargrove pulled on Silver Meridian before he walked in here, he said. The VA compliance audit from 8 months ago, the one that came back clean. What about it? It was signed off by a senior program inspector named Darren Quill. Mason paused. Darren Quill retired from federal service 14 months ago. He retired, Elena. He wasn't working for the VA 8 months ago. He was not in a position to sign off on anything. The terminal noise continued around them. A gate announcement, rolling luggage, a child laughing somewhere down the concourse. Someone used a retired inspector's credentials to sign a federal audit, Elena said. Someone used a retired inspector's credentials to close a federal audit, Mason said. There's a difference. The audit wasn't routine. It was triggered by a complaint. He held her gaze. A complaint filed by a patient who had been forcibly discharged from Silver Meridian and was trying to report equipment fraud. Elena's stomach dropped 3 inches. Adrian, she said. He tried to report it through official channels, Mason said, and someone inside the federal inspection system killed the report before it ever reached anyone who would act on it. He stood. The federal agent beside him was watching the corridor. Which means this isn't just Silver Meridian, Elena said. No, Mason said. It isn't. Atlas pressed his flank against Elena's left leg. Steady, warm, immovable. Can you walk? Mason said. Elena gripped her crutch and stood on one leg in one locked brace, and whatever was living in her chest in that moment, the anger, the exhaustion, the cold clarity of realizing exactly how deep this went, she filed it into the back of her mind with the same efficiency she used to file everything that couldn't be dealt with until the patient was stabilized. Yes, she said. She walked. The airport operations room was not designed for the kind of meeting that was now taking place inside it. It was a functional space, two folding tables pushed together, a wall of monitors showing terminal camera feeds, a whiteboard with flight status annotations in 3 colors of marker, and chairs that had been purchased for utility rather than comfort. The overhead lighting was fluorescent and unforgiving. A half-empty coffee pot sat on a filing cabinet in the corner, and the smell of it had been burning for long enough that it had stopped smelling like coffee and started smelling like something else entirely. Elena sat at one end of the table with her left leg extended, the brace still locked, and a rolled jacket that one of the federal agents had offered without being asked positioned under her knee to reduce the compression angle. It was a small thing. She noted it. The federal agent who had done it was named Hargrove, Specialist Lena Hargrove, NCIS, who had arrived through the airport operations corridor with 2 colleagues and a hard-sided equipment case that she handled with the specific care of someone transporting something that mattered. She was compact and precise, with the kind of stillness in her movements that came from spending time in situations where unnecessary motion was a liability. The other 2 agents, a man named Destin Okafor and another who had introduced himself only as Price, had positioned themselves near the door and the window respectively, with the instinctive geometry of people who thought in terms of exit vectors. Mason stood at the end of the table opposite Elena. Atlas had been directed to a corner where he sat with the patience of a dog who understood that his current assignment was to stay out of the way and wait. He was managing it imperfectly. His eyes kept returning to the brace. "We have 2 problems," Hargrove said, setting the equipment case on the table. "The first is extracting the data from the transmitter without destroying it, which requires a non-invasive approach, and about 30 minutes, I'm not sure we have. The second is the man from the gate area who walked away." "He's being tracked?" Mason said. "We have eyes on him until he exits the terminal. After that, we're relying on the airport's external camera coverage, which has gaps." Hargrove looked at Elena. "You said the gate agent, Darby, filed a complaint acknowledgement before your fall. Is that accurate?" "She said she'd noted in the system. Whether she did is a different question. We need that documentation. If Silver Meridian's people are in this airport, and given the surveillance response to your position, that's no longer a question. They may have access to the airline's complaint system. If there's a flag on your name from this morning's incident, they know you're in the building." Elena looked at her. "They already know I'm in the building. That man at the gate was looking directly at me." "Right, but there's a difference between someone spotted you and your name is in a searchable database with your flight record attached." Hargrove paused. "Your flight record includes your home address." The room was quiet for a moment. "Then we have 3 problems," Elena said. Hargrove opened the equipment case. Inside, nested in foam, was a device that Elena recognized as an electromagnetic scanning unit, a more sophisticated version of the equipment used in hospitals to locate embedded metallic components without invasive procedures. Beside it was a secondary unit she didn't recognize, smaller and sealed in its own housing. "The transmitter is running on a frequency Atlas was conditioned to detect," Hargrove said, looking at Mason. "Do you have the original conditioning protocol documentation?" "In my kit at the base. I can have it transmitted to your secure system in... Too slow. What do you remember about the frequency band?" Mason gave her a number. Hargrove typed it, looked at the screen on the scanning unit, typed a second number and a parameter adjustment. "It's running a compressed burst transmission," she said after a moment. 15-second intervals, which means the data isn't a continuous signal, it's packaged. Whoever Adrian used to build this knew how to avoid standard detection sweeps. She looked at the brace. The burst pattern is designed to look like microprocessor noise from the medical device itself. Even a targeted scan would likely miss it. "Which is why it passed security for 8 months, Elena said. "Which is why it passed security for 8 months, Hargrove confirmed. "And why the joint locked. I think the locking mechanism wasn't a malfunction. I think it was an activation sequence. The transmitter intensifying its signal to draw attention when it detected something in its environment." Elena stared at her. "Atlas's conditioning frequency." The dog's presence triggered an escalation in the transmitter output, which caused the microprocessor to receive conflicting signals, which locked the joint. Hargrove met Elena's eyes with something that was almost an apology. "Your brace functioned exactly the way it was supposed to. Adrian Solt engineered it to fail in a way that would force someone to pay attention." The understanding of it settled over Elena in layers. It had not been an accident. The pain in her hip and her elbow, the floor of the boarding lane, the passengers who had walked around her. All of it had been, in a clinical sense, intentional. A disabled woman falling in an airport was not something that drew immediate, serious response. It was something that people looked away from, or stepped around, or filed paperwork about. Adrian had known that. He had known that a locked brace would ground her in one place long enough for the right person to find her. He had known because he had been inside the system long enough to understand exactly how it worked. "I want to be angry about this," Elena said. "I'll deal with that later. Right now, how do we get the data out?" Hargrove was already positioning the scanning unit near Elena's leg. "I can extract the burst packet without opening the housing. The secondary device," she indicated the smaller sealed unit, "will capture and decode the transmission. But I need silence and about 20 minutes of stability. Define stability. Don't move the leg." Elena settled her hands in her lap and did not move the leg. The scanning process was not dramatic. Hargrove worked with quiet concentration, adjusting parameters and watching readouts, occasionally typing a command and waiting. The room held the particular silence of people who understood that the wrong kind of noise at the wrong moment had consequences. Price, near the window, had his eyes on the external camera feed on a tablet. Okafor had stepped into the corridor and was talking quietly into his phone. Mason came and sat in the chair beside Elena. Not close, just in proximity. The way people sit when they are performing the opposite of abandonment. "Your brother," he said quietly. "Dominic, you were going to him." "Yes." "We'll need to notify him that your travel plans have changed." "I know." She paused. "He'll be fine. He's had one surgery before. He knows what he's doing." She paused again. "He'll also be furious on my behalf about the airline thing, which will give him something to focus on besides the pain, so in a way this is fine." Mason looked at her sideways. Something in his expression shifted in a way she hadn't seen before. Brief and unguarded, like a door opening and closing. "You do that a lot?" he said. "Do what?" "Find the functional angle on something bad. Occupational habit." She looked at the scanning unit. "You do it too." "Yeah," he said. "I do." Hargrove said, "I've got the packet." Everyone in the room reoriented toward her. Hargrove was watching the secondary device's screen with the intense focus of someone reading something important fast. "Give me 60 seconds, she said. The 60 seconds were long. Elena counted them without meaning to, the way she counted seconds during a code when she needed to track CPR intervals without looking at a clock. Old reflex. "Okay?" Hargrove sat back. Her face was controlled, but something in it had shifted. The specific quality of someone who has just read something larger than they expected. "There are 3 files. The first is a patient record database. Looks like it contains documentation of equipment allocations for veterans in the Silver Meridian program going back at least 4 years. Partial records. Enough to show the pattern of items logged as issued that were never actually in patient use." "How many patients?" Mason said. Hargrove looked at the number. "At minimum, 212 documented cases." The room absorbed that. "The second file is financial," she continued. "Transfer records. Equipment serial numbers matched against private resale documentation. The devices were being sold. Not scrapped, not redirected to another program. Sold. Through a secondary market broker, operating under a shell company." She looked up. "The shell company's registration traces back to a holding entity in Delwick County." Price from the window said, "Delwick County is where Silver Meridian's regional headquarters is." "Yes," Hargrove said. "And the third file?" Mason said. Hargrove paused in a way that was not hesitation. It was preparation. "The third file is a list of names," she said, 14 names. Federal employees, VA program officers, 1 active duty officer in the Inspector General's office. And she stopped. "And Darren Quill." "The inspector whose credentials were used to close Adrian's complaint," Elena said. "His credentials weren't stolen," Hargrove said. "His name is in the file as a co-signer, a participant. He didn't retire and then have his credentials used without his knowledge. He retired and then continued to provide sign-off on compliance reviews through an informal arrangement that kept him off the official payroll while keeping him useful." She set the device down. "He knew. He was part of it." Mason was very still. 14 names, he said. 14, Hargrove said, and the list includes the NCIS case officer who closed Adrian's original wellness report. Nobody spoke for a moment. Elena could hear the HVAC system cycling, the faint sound of a gate announcement from somewhere in the terminal, and a noise from the corridor that made Okafor's voice cut off. Then Okafor opened the door. "We have a problem," he said. His face had the specific tightness of someone who had just received information that made the current situation significantly more complicated. The man from the gate, the one in the navy jacket, he didn't leave the airport. He went to the airline's customer service counter. Hargrove said, "He's accessing her travel record." "He accessed it," Okafor said, past tense. And then he made a phone call, 20-second call. And then the airport's external camera feed on the North Access Road went offline. The room's atmosphere changed in the way that rooms change when people who are trained to recognize escalation simultaneously. "They're calling in assets," Mason said. It was not a question. "Someone cut the camera feed. That's not a solo operation." Okafor looked at Elena. "Your address is in the travel record. If they have people mobile—" "My brother," Elena said. The word came out flat. She had already done the calculation before Okafor had finished the sentence. The address in the travel record was her home address in Harlow City, not Dominic's address, but Silver Meridian had patient records. They had a rehabilitation file. They had the program intake documentation, which included emergency contact information, Dominic's name, Dominic's address. "I need a phone," she said. Mason had his in her hand before she finished the sentence. She dialed. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She tried again. 3 rings. Voicemail. "He may be sleeping," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. "He had surgery 6 days ago. He sleeps heavily because of the pain medication. He doesn't always hear his phone." She looked at Mason. "I need someone at his address." "Harlow City is 40 minutes from here," Okafor said. "Harlow City PD can be there in—" "No," Hargrove said, and her voice was precise. "If Silver Meridian has contacts in federal systems, we don't know the extent of it. Running a local police call through dispatch creates a record. We don't know who's reading those records." Elena looked at Hargrove. "You're saying we can't trust local police?" "I'm saying we don't know the boundaries of the network yet. Until we do, every official channel is a potential leak." The understanding was ugly. The data on the secondary device's screen represented 14 names in federal and military roles, the visible ones, the ones Adrian had been able to document. The actual network could be larger. It could reach into local enforcement. It could reach into hospital systems. It could reach into the rehabilitation infrastructure that had fitted this brace and sent Elena Voss through airports for 8 months without her knowledge. The scope of it was large enough to be disorienting if she let it be. She did not let it be. "Options," she said. "I have a contact in the Marshal's service who is not on this list and who I would trust with my life," Hargrove said. "I can have him dispatched to your brother's location with a cover reason that doesn't require running it through standard channels. 15 minutes. "Make the call," Elena said. Hargrove was already on it. Mason moved to the window beside Price and looked at the tablet showing the external camera feeds, the ones that were still functioning. Elena watched his profile and saw the things she recognized from the ward, the things she had seen on the faces of experienced people in critical moments, the simultaneous management of multiple timelines, present and projected, running parallel calculations and prioritizing actions by consequence rather than urgency. "The man who walked away from the gate is still in the building," she said. "Probably," Mason said, "and he knows we're in this room. He knows we went to operations. He doesn't know which room. How long before they narrow it down?" Mason looked at the door, at the single camera mounted above it, showing the corridor, at the airport badge hanging from Okafor's lanyard, which was a visitor credential and not a staff credential, and would not open every door in this building. "They won't come through the front," he said. "Too visible. Too many cameras still running in the main terminal. They'll find a service access point." He looked at Price. "The north camera feed that went down. What does that corridor access?" Price checked the tablet. His expression told Elena the answer before he spoke. "Loading dock," he said. "And the service corridor that runs behind the operations wing." The door at the far end of the room, the one Elena had assumed led to a utility closet, was a service access door. She looked at it, at the gap under it. at the fact that it had a different lock mechanism than the main door, older, with a key cylinder rather than a keypad. "That door," she said. Everyone looked. The gap under the service door showed light on the other side. It had been showing light since they entered the room. Elena had registered it automatically and filed it as ambient, a corridor light left on. She registered it now differently, as a corridor light that had not been on when they first entered, that had come on at some point in the last 40 minutes while they had been focused on the scanning unit and the data files and the phone call to Dominic that had not been answered. "Someone's in the service corridor," she said. Atlas stood up from his corner. The dog's posture had changed in the way that working dogs change when a threat graduates from potential to present. Not aggressive, not loud, but dense with attention. Every line of his body oriented toward the service door with the focused certainty of an animal whose senses had resolved a question the humans in the room were still asking. "Riker," Price said, "I see it." Hargrove ended her call and had her weapon out in a movement that was entirely unremarkable in its speed. Not theatrical, just fast, the way practice things are fast. Okafor had moved to a position beside the main door. Price was backing away from the window. Mason looked at Elena. She was already moving, pushing her chair back, getting the crutch positioned, rising on her right leg. The locked brace was a problem, but not a stopping problem. She had managed it for 40 minutes. She could manage it for whatever came next. "Behind the table," Mason said. "I'm not—" "I know you're not. I'm asking you to be harder to reach, not to hide." His voice was level. "Behind the table, and if that door opens, you go through the main door with Okafor." She moved behind the table. Atlas did not move. He stayed between Elena and the service door with an unbroken focus that made the hair on the back of Elena's neck respond to something older than thought. The light under the service door shifted. A shadow moved across it. Brief, deliberate, someone on the other side of the door who was not moving casually. Then a knock. Not a forced entry, not a handle being tested. A knock. 3 measured impacts, spaced, like a code. And Okafor said very quietly, "That's a marshal's contact signal." The tension in the room did not entirely release. It reorganized. Hargrove looked at Okafor. "You're certain? If Castilla is your marshal contact, that's his pattern. We worked a protection detail in 21. Hargrove crossed to the service door, weapon still out, and said through it, "Who authorized your presence?" A voice came through, muffled by the door. "Hargrove, it's Castilla. I'm not alone. I have something you need to hear." Hargrove looked at Mason. Mason looked at Okafor. Okafor nodded once. She opened the door. The man who came through first was broad, mid-40s, in civilian clothes with a marshal's credential case already open and visible. He moved the way Hargrove moved, contained, deliberate, accounting for the room's geometry before accounting for anything else. He looked at Elena and looked at the brace and looked at Atlas and then looked at Mason. "We found your missing captain," he said. The room went entirely still. "Where?" Mason said. "Silver Meridian's residential facility outside Dunmore. It's a locked ward they're operating under a psychiatric hold designation. He's been held there for 8 months under a name that isn't his." Castilla's voice was flat, with the particular flatness of controlled anger. "He's alive. He's not well. They've been medicating him to suppress the TBI symptom documentation, using the TBI diagnosis he came in with as cover for a treatment protocol that wasn't treating anything." Elena heard the words and understood them immediately and medically in a way that the others in the room took a moment longer to process. Suppressing TBI symptoms through medication was not treatment. It was management, keeping a patient non-functional enough to be non-threatening while maintaining the medical paper fiction that they were receiving appropriate care. It required a physician, a licensed physician who was willing to sign off on a treatment protocol they knew was punitive rather than therapeutic. "There's a doctor involved," she said. Castilla looked at her. "A psychiatrist named Fenwick. His name isn't on the list in your file. He came into the arrangement separately." He paused. "He was not hard to find once we knew where Adrian was. His signature is on every treatment order for the past 8 months." "Is Adrian stable?" Mason said. His voice had an edge in it now that had not been there before. Not loud, not ragged, just present in a way that made the word stable carry more weight than it normally would. "He's conscious. He's oriented. The medication they've been using has a relatively short clearance time, 48 hours off it, and he'll be significantly clearer. Castilla met Mason's eyes. But there's a problem. Tell me. The facility knows we've located him. Not us specifically, but the surveillance response here at the airport triggered something. Someone in the network sent an alert. When my people arrived at the Dunmore facility 20 minutes ago to make contact, the front desk was in the process of generating a transfer order. They were going to move him. Did they move him? No, my people are on site, but they're 4 agents against a residential facility with security staff and a medical director who believes he has legal authorization to move a patient. Castilla's jaw tightened. What I need from you right now is the federal authorization to place that facility under immediate review and halt any patient transfers. And to get that, I need the data from the transmitter in an official submission to the Inspector General's office, one that bypasses the compromised case officer. Hargrove said, "The data is extracted. I can have it in a verified submission in 30 minutes is too long," Castilla said. "They're running the transfer paperwork right now. If they move him before the review halt is issued, we lose him. They'll put him somewhere we can't find in 48 hours. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when a situation has reached the point where someone has to make a decision that can't be walked back. Mason looked at Elena. She didn't know why he looked at her. She was not NCIS, not a federal agent, not part of this command structure in any meaningful way. She was a disabled civilian nurse who had come to an airport to catch a flight to see her brother and had ended up in an operations room with a locked brace and a transmitter and a data file that was apparently the key to finding a missing Navy captain. But Mason was looking at her, and she understood after a moment that he was not looking to her for a decision. He was looking at her because she was the center of this. Not instrumentally, not as an asset, but as the person who had been used and fallen and ignored and was still in the room, still upright, still functional, still here. Whatever happened in the next 30 minutes would happen because she had not gotten on that plane. "What do you need from me?" she said. Castilla looked at her. "Your sworn statement about how you received this device and what you've observed this morning goes into the submission as a civilian witness declaration. It elevates the evidentiary status and allows the IG's office to issue an emergency review halt on statutory authority rather than waiting for a full investigation trigger." "Then let's write the statement," she said. "It needs to be done in the next 12 minutes. Elena looked at the notebook in her jacket pocket. At the documentation she had begun making that morning, standing at the gate desk with Darby's name and the time and the sequence of events. Documentation that now contained a great deal more than an accessibility complaint. "I've been taking notes since 6:15 this morning," she said. "Give me a pen and something to write on." Hargrove had both in front of her before the sentence finished. Elena Voss, former United States Navy trauma nurse, began writing her statement at 7:43 in the morning in an airport operations room with a locked brace on her left leg, a bruised hip, and the particular clarity of someone who has passed the point where being afraid was a useful response to anything. She wrote quickly. The words came in the ordered, precise sequence of a clinical documentation. Dates, times, direct observations, the exact words people had used, the exact sequence of events without editorializing or interpretation. It was the same skill she had used for 8 years in nursing notes. The discipline of recording what happened as it happened, without the distortion of emotion or the softening of hindsight. She finished in 9 minutes. Hargrove photographed each page, transmitted the file, and made the call. The room waited. Outside the terminal windows, visible on the monitor feed from a camera that had not been cut, a car was pulling into the loading dock access. Not a Silver Meridian vehicle. A black sedan with federal plates. But beside it, getting out of the passenger side with the deliberate movement of someone who had been given enough medication in the past 8 months to slow every physical process, but whose eyes were entirely, unmistakably alert, was a man Elena did not recognize, but Mason clearly did. Because the sound that came out of Mason Riker in that moment was not a word and not entirely controlled. And Atlas immediately stood and turned toward his handler with the attention of a dog responding to something real. "That's Adrian," Mason said. His voice had a crack in it that he did not try to hide and did not seem to notice. The car had not come from Dunmore. Castilla's phone rang and he answered it and listened and said, "Copy," and hung up and looked at the room. "The facility tried to move him through the service exit," he said. "My people intercepted the transfer vehicle 2 blocks from the Dunmore facility. He's been in federal protective custody for the last 11 minutes. He paused. And the facility's medical director just attempted to delete 8 months of patient records from the internal server. Hargrove was already typing. Too late, she said. The data package from the transmitter included a mirrored copy of the server backup. Adrian built in a redundancy. She looked up. He mirrored their records 8 months ago before they discharged him. Everything they've tried to delete in the last 11 minutes was already in federal custody before they started. The car outside moved to the operations entrance. In 4 minutes, the door was going to open, and the missing captain who had hidden a transmitter inside a nurse's brace and trusted that probability and a Belgian Malinois in 8 months of time would eventually create the right moment. That man was going to walk into this room. And in the corridor on the other side of the main door, footsteps were approaching that did not belong to Castilla's people. The camera feed above the door showed the man in the navy jacket, no longer alone, 2 additional figures moving with the specific body language of people who had stopped being cautious and started being desperate. They were 60 seconds away. The Federal Review halt was either in the Inspector General's system or it wasn't. Hargrove's phone rang. Hargrove answered on the first ring. She listened for 11 seconds. Elena counted. Then Hargrove said, "Confirmed," and lowered the phone, and the expression on her face was not relief exactly. It was the specific look of someone who had been holding a structure together by hand and had just felt it click into place on its own. "The halt is issued," she said. "Emergency review authorization under Inspector General's statute. All Silver Meridian facilities are frozen. No patient transfers, no record modifications, no personnel departures. Federal marshals are en route to their Dunmore location and their regional headquarters in Delwick County." She paused. "And a warrant package for 14 individuals is being processed as of 4 minutes ago." The main door opened at the same moment. Not the men from the corridor. Those footsteps had stopped, 20 feet short of the operations room, with the specific hesitation of people who had received information mid-approach that changed their calculation. The door that opened was the one Castilla's people controlled, and through it came 2 of his agents and, between them, a man who moved with the careful, deliberate pace of someone relearning how to trust his own body. Adrian Solt was tall, or had been tall. The 8 months had taken something from his posture that would come back eventually, but was not back yet. He was in his mid-30s, with the broad-shouldered frame of someone built for physical work and the specific quality of pallor that came from extended indoor confinement and a medication load that suppressed more than it treated. His eyes, though, were the contradiction in all of it. They were entirely present. Whatever Fenwick's protocol had done to his body, it had not reached what was behind those eyes. He came into the room and looked at Mason and stopped. Mason crossed to him in 4 steps. He put both hands on Adrian's shoulders. Not an embrace, not immediately, just contact, the grip of someone confirming with their hands what their eyes were telling them. Adrian closed his eyes for 3 seconds and then opened them. "You got the signal," Adrian said. His voice was rough from disuse. "Atlas got the signal," Mason said. Adrian looked past Mason to where Atlas was standing, and the dog moved to him immediately. Not frantic, not jumping, just direct and certain, pushing his head against Adrian's hand with the uncomplicated intensity of an animal that had been searching for something and found it. Adrian's hand moved over the dog's head with the automatic ease of long familiarity, and something in the set of his face changed. "Good boy," he said quietly. "Good boy." Then he looked at Elena. She was still behind the table, still with the crutch positioned and the locked brace extended. He looked at the brace. The way someone looks at a thing they built and sent into the world, and were not certain would survive the journey. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the fall. I didn't know who would end up with the device. I couldn't control that part of it." "I know," Elena said. "I designed the lock sequence to activate in proximity to Atlas's conditioning frequency. I knew Mason would come through this airport. I knew if I could get the brace to someone who traveled." "I understand the logic," Elena said. "I'm not asking for an explanation right now. I'm asking if you're medically stable enough to give a statement." Adrian blinked. Then something crossed his face that was close to, startled, and then close to something else. "Yes," he said. "Then sit down. Hargrove needs you." He sat. Hargrove was already moving toward him with documentation. And the footsteps in the corridor, the ones that had stopped 20 feet short, began again, but differently this time, slower. And then there was a different sound, voices, and the specific cadence of someone being told to put their hands where they could be seen. Castilla's people had met the men from the corridor outside the door. Elena exhaled through her nose and looked at the ceiling for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked back at the room and at the work still in front of them. The next 3 hours were not cinematic. They were procedural and exhausting, and marked by the particular unglamour of real consequence. Statements taken and retaken, documentation cross-referenced, calls made to offices that needed to be convinced before they would authorize the next step in a chain that required every step to hold. Hargrove ran the room with the focused efficiency of someone who had managed complex multi-agency operations before, and knew that the critical window after a major move was the time when everything could still unravel if someone let their attention slip. Elena gave her statement twice, once verbally, once in a formal recorded session. Her notebook had become an evidentiary document, photographed page by page and logged into the federal case file. The entries she had made that morning, Darby's name, the times, the sequence of events at Gate 14B, were now part of a record that existed in a federal system and could not be deleted by anyone with access to the airline's complaint database. She thought about that while a federal document specialist photographed the last page. She had taken those notes out of habit, out of the reflex of a woman who had spent years learning that the people most likely to have their experiences dismissed were the ones who didn't write things down. She had not known it would matter to anything beyond her own complaint. It mattered to considerably more. The man in the navy jacket, whose name turned out to be Croft, a former program security consultant for Silver Meridian with no formal law enforcement background and a contractor arrangement that had given him access to VA-adjacent databases, was processed by Castilla's agents in the corridor and transported to a federal holding facility. His colleague from the food kiosk had made it to the airport's north parking structure before being intercepted by a local marshal who was not connected to the compromised network and who seemed, from Castilla's brief account of it, to have been entirely willing to help once the federal authorization was confirmed. The medical director at the Dunmore facility, a man named Harstad, who had signed off on 8 months of Adrian's confinement without ever appearing in any of the Silver Meridian promotional materials or public-facing documents, attempted to access the facility's server remotely from a personal device at 9:41 that morning. The attempt was logged, flagged, and used to add an obstruction count to what was already a significant charge list. Hargrove received the notification on her phone and said nothing, just made a mark in her notes with the expression of someone adding a final item to a list they had been keeping for a long time. Fenwick, the psychiatrist, had not reported to work that morning. His residential address was under observation. He had not traveled. The hold extended to transportation, and his name had been added to the relevant watch systems within 20 minutes of the halt authorization. He was contained, even if not yet in custody. Contained was enough for now. Elena's brace was unlocked by the technical agent Hargrove had brought, a man named Voss, which she noted with flat amusement was her own last name, who used the scanning equipment to manually override the lock joint without disturbing the transmitter housing. The release was not elegant. It involved a specific tool applied to the side panel, 3 precise pressure points, and a reset sequence that took 8 minutes because the first 2 attempts partially cycled and stopped. When the joint finally released, the sensation of the brace returning to its normal compression was significant enough that she had to breathe through it for a moment. The technical agent looked at her with professional concern. "Pain level?" "Manageable," she said. "Don't stop." He finished the reset. The microprocessor cycled correctly. She stood carefully, tested the brace through its range of motion, and identified a compensation pattern in her right hip that had developed during the locked hours and would need attention. She filed it. Then she walked to the window and looked at the tarmac and thought about Dominic. Hargrove had dispatched a contact to his address within the 12-minute window. The contact had confirmed he was home, unharmed, bewildered, and Hargrove's word, vocal. Elena had spoken to him briefly during a break in her statement, and the conversation had been exactly what she'd predicted. He was fine, he was angry on her behalf about the airline, and he told her to stay and deal with it and come when she could. He had his neighbor's number. He was not helpless. She had told him she knew and she would come soon. She had not told him everything else. That could wait. She was still at the window when Mason came to stand beside her. He had been with Adrian since Adrian sat down, moving between the room's active work and the chair where his teammate was talking to Hargrove with the steady, careful pace of someone giving information that had been held under pressure for 8 months and was finally, painfully, being released. He knew it would take time, Mason said. That was the hardest part for him, he said, designing something that depended on probability instead of planning. He couldn't know when. He couldn't know who. He could only know that eventually the conditions would be right. He's an engineer, Elena said. Explosive ordnance before the TBI. He thinks in systems. Mason was quiet for a moment. He said he chose mobility device patients specifically because they were the population Silver Meridian was exploiting. He wanted the evidence carrier to be someone the program had already failed. He thought— Mason stopped. He thought it was the least he could do. Make it count for someone they'd already hurt. Elena looked at the tarmac, at the aircraft moving on the far runway, ordinary and indifferent. It's a reasonable logic, she said. Doesn't make the fall less real. No, Mason said, it doesn't. I'm not saying that to make him feel worse. I know. He knows too. Mason paused. He asked me to tell you. He said he'd rather tell you himself, but wasn't sure he had the right to ask for that. Elena considered this. Outside, the morning had moved into mid-morning, and the airport was at full activity now. Passengers flowing through the terminals, gate announcements overlapping, the routine commerce of people going places. She had come here to go to her brother. She had ended up here instead. Tell him I'll talk to him when Hargrove's done with him, she said. And tell him the fall is not the thing I'm holding against anyone. What are you holding against someone? She looked at him. The boarding lane. The 40 minutes. The way Darby looked at me when I asked for my zone, and she decided it was easier to run the clock than to solve the problem. She turned back to the window. That part has nothing to do with Adrian and everything to do with a system that treats people as inconveniences until the inconvenience becomes someone else's problem. Mason was quiet. I know, he said. That complaint goes forward too. I know it does, as I made sure of it. She paused. That was the other thing I was doing this morning, not just surviving a federal evidence situation, also documenting an accessibility failure in a public transport facility. Both things can be true. He almost smiled. She could see it in her peripheral vision, the restraint of it, deliberate, the choice not to smile at something that was not quite funny enough to smile at. The operations room behind them had shifted into a lower gear, the acute urgency of the early morning replaced by the sustained, methodical work of building a case that would hold. Hargrove was on her third call in an hour to the Inspector General's office. Adrian had moved from formal statement to informal debrief, sitting across from an agent who was taking notes on a legal pad, his voice gaining steadiness with each exchange. Atlas had settled at his feet in the specific way of a dog who had completed his assignment and was now simply present. At 11:17, the news broke, not through official channels, through a passenger. The same airport that had watched Elena Voss fall on the floor of Gate 14B's boarding lane and stepped around her had also watched the aftermath. The federal agents moving through the concourse, the operations room activity visible through the corridor windows, the man in the navy jacket being walked out with his hands positioned in a way that was not ambiguous. A passenger in the Gate 14B waiting area had filmed a portion of it on a phone. The clip was 23 seconds long and showed federal personnel escorting Croft through the concourse, and it was on 3 platforms before noon. The clip would have been ambient noise in the daily flood of airport incident footage, except that a journalist who covered federal contractor fraud had seen it, recognized Croft from a 3-year-old report on VA-adjacent contracting irregularities, and filed 6 public records requests by 12:30. Hargrove received a notification about it and said, very quietly, "Well, good or bad?" Okafor said. "Accelerating," she said, "which is both." The acceleration meant that Silver Meridian's communications team, which had been operating under the assumption that the morning's events were contained, began receiving media inquiries before the warrant packages were fully processed. The organization's public-facing director, a woman named Petra Corvin, who had no apparent knowledge of the fraud operation and was in fact the person who had built the program's legitimate rehabilitation services, received a call from a reporter at 12:44 and called the VA's compliance office in a state of alarm at 12:49. That call was routed to an office that was already aware of the situation and was in the process of cooperating with the federal investigation. The person who took the call informed Corvin of the basic outlines of what had been uncovered. Corvin's response, recorded and later included in the investigative record, was 17 seconds of silence followed by a single sentence that indicated she understood the magnitude of what had been done inside an organization she had believed she was running. She retained a lawyer and began cooperating by 2 o'clock. Lorraine Veth, the program administrator who had filed Adrian's fraudulent discharge paperwork, was located at her home address at 1:15 and taken into federal custody without incident. She said nothing at the time of arrest and continued saying nothing, which was her right and which did not matter, because the records Adrian had mirrored 8 months ago contained her signature on 47 documents that described, in the precise administrative language of program management, the systematic diversion of equipment from disabled veterans to a resale network. 47 documents. 47 separate occasions on which she had signed her name to something she knew was false. The paper trail was comprehensive. Adrian had understood that paper was more durable than testimony, more durable than memory, more durable than the goodwill of institutions that might prefer a problem to disappear. He had built his evidence in paper, mirrored it into a transmitter that had traveled 8 months through airports and medical appointments and daily life, and waited. The waiting was the part that none of it fully accounted for. 8 months in a locked ward, medicated to a level that kept him present but not functional, aware of the transmitter and the plan and the probability that it might never work, that Mason might not come through that airport on the right day, that the patient carrying the brace might never travel again. He had built a plan that could fail on any of a dozen variables, and he had lived inside that plan for 8 months without knowing if it had worked. Elena thought about that in the spaces between the procedural demands of the afternoon. She thought about the specific quality of that kind of waiting, not passive, not resigned, but sustained in the way that only people with a particular kind of interior discipline can sustain it. She had seen it in patients before. The ones who survived the unsurvivable things were not always the strongest. They were often the most specific, the ones who found one thing to hold on to and held it with the precision of someone who knows that loosening their grip even slightly would cost them everything. Adrian had held on to a Belgian Malinois and an airport and a probability. It had worked. At 2:40 in the afternoon, Elena finally reached the medical team at Harlow City Medical Center's orthopedic department, explained the morning's events in broad terms, and arranged for an emergency assessment of her brace and her left leg's current status. The nurse who took the call, a woman named Tara who had worked with Elena on the trauma floor for 3 years, was silent for a long moment after the explanation and then said, "So you're telling me you spent 6 hours in a locked brace, gave multiple federal statements, and your main concern is that your hip is going to be stiff tomorrow?" "My main concern is whether the brace's microprocessor calibration was affected by the override reset," Elena said. "You need to come in." "I'll come in when I can come in. Right now I'm still needed here." Elena: "I know my body, Tara. I'm monitoring it. I'll come in today." She did not come in today. She came in the following morning, which was technically today adjacent if you were generous with definitions, and the assessment confirmed bruising of the iliac crest, minor soft tissue irritation in the left ankle consistent with several hours of abnormal joint loading, and a microprocessor calibration that was, in fact, 3% off its baseline settings and needed a manufacturer's adjustment. None of it was serious. None of it was nothing. She told Dominic everything the evening of the first day, sitting in his apartment in Merritt Bay with a bag of ice on her hip and his 2-week post-surgical knee elevated on a pillow, both of them injured and tired and eating takeout from the place 2 blocks away. That did a lemongrass soup he had been recommending to her for a year. It was not a conversation that had a natural shape. There was too much in it, too many pieces that belonged to different categories of story. She told it in order, which helped. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him and indicated how seriously he was taking it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The gate agent, Darby." "Yes." "She's going to say she was following protocol." "Yes." "And the accessibility desk woman?" "Greta." "Yes." "She'll say the same." "And the first agent, Ferris, at check-in?" "All of them will say they were following protocol," Elena said. "And some of them were. The protocol is the problem." She shifted the ice. "The complaint is filed against the airline's operational procedure as much as the individual employees. I'm asking for a review of how mobility assistance requests are communicated between check-in, the accessibility desk, and gate staff. The gap between those 3 points is where my request disappeared. That gap needs to close. Dominic looked at her for a long moment. He had her same bone structure and her same tendency to go quiet when processing something complicated. "You fell on the floor," he said, "in front of people who walked around you." "Yes." "And your first instinct was to document it." "My first instinct was to get upright," she said. "The documentation came second." He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, in something closer to recognition. "You're going to do something with this," he said. "I'm already doing something with it," she said. At 9:17 the following morning, Darren Quill was taken into federal custody at the golf course outside Pelham Township, where he had been spending his retirement. He was escorted off the course in front of 4 other players and a groundskeeper, which was not by design. The agents had simply arrived during his standing Tuesday morning round, and the image of a former federal inspector being walked to a government vehicle with a golf club still in one hand was the photograph that ended up on the front page of the Delaware County Gazette 2 days later, under a headline that used the word fraud twice. The compromised NCIS case officer, a man named Troll, was placed on administrative suspension pending the investigation, which was the institutional language for removed from any position where he could affect the outcome of an investigation he had actively suppressed. His attorney issued a statement suggesting his client had acted within his authority and looked forward to the opportunity to provide context. The 14 names on Adrian's list began, one by one, acquiring legal representation. Silver Meridian's operations were suspended in full. The 212 documented cases of diverted equipment became the centerpiece of the VA's emergency audit, which expanded within a week to cover 431 veterans whose program records showed inconsistencies. The shell company in Delaware County was traced to 2 additional holding entities, which were traced to a resale network that had moved equipment through 3 states over 4 years. The scope of it was large enough to require a dedicated investigative unit, which was assembled within 72 hours of the warrant package being processed. Elena was not part of that unit. She was a witness, a complainant, and eventually a consultant on the medical documentation aspects of the case, which required someone who could read a treatment protocol and identify where the clinical justification stopped making sense. She did that work remotely, from Harlow City, between shifts at the medical center, in the specific gaps of a life that had not stopped simply because an extraordinary thing had happened inside it. The airline complaint was adjudicated separately through a formal accessibility review process that took 3 weeks and ultimately produced a finding that the airline's intersystem communication protocol for mobility assistance requests was inadequate and had resulted in a documented failure of duty of care toward a passenger with a documented disability. The finding recommended mandatory protocol revision and staff retraining. It did not name Darby or Ferris or Greta individually. It named the system. Elena received the finding in a standard email. She read it twice, printed it, and filed it in the same folder as her morning's notes from the airport. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks after the day at Vasker Falls, she received a call from a number she did not recognize. She almost did not answer it. She was between patients, standing in the corridor of the medical center's post-surgical ward, and her phone had been ringing with unusual frequency since the story had become public enough to be findable by people who looked. She had developed a policy of unknown number caution, but something, the specific area code, or the time of day, or some probability her brain had assembled without consulting her, made her answer. "Ms. Voss." The voice was formal, measured, belonging to someone in an institutional role. "This is the office of the VA's Undersecretary for Benefits. I'm calling to inform you that a comprehensive review of veteran rehabilitation program protocols has been initiated, and your formal complaint documentation has been designated as foundational evidence for that review." A pause. "The Undersecretary would like to speak with you personally about your experience and your recommendations." Elena was quiet for a moment. Around her, the corridor continued its afternoon rhythms. A monitor alarmed briefly and was silenced. A patient called for a nurse 2 rooms down. A cart with medication trays moved past her, pushed by a tech who nodded without breaking stride. "When?" she said. "This week, if possible. Thursday." "I can do Thursday." "Excellent. And Ms. Voss, on behalf of the office, I want to say that the documentation you produced under extremely difficult circumstances was—" "I was taking notes," Elena said. That's what I do. Tell the undersecretary I'll see her Thursday. She hung up. She stood in the corridor for a moment longer. The post-surgical ward was fully occupied this week. 11 patients, 6 of them in varying stages of mobility recovery, 3 of them veterans. She had 3 more patients to check before end of shift. She put her phone in her pocket and started walking. The brace moved with her, calibrated and correct, the microprocessor cycling through its adjustments the way it had been designed to do. 3 weeks after Vasker falls, 2 days after Lorraine Veth entered a plea negotiation that the prosecutors described as significant, and on the morning when Fenwick was finally taken into custody at a rental property outside the county line where he had been quietly waiting to see how things resolved. On that same morning, Hargrove called Elena with the information that the VA's emergency audit had confirmed a 5th organization operating in parallel with Silver Meridian, using a different name and a different VA district, but the same shell company structure, and in one case, the same secondary market broker. The network was larger than anyone in that operations room 3 weeks ago had estimated. And the list of names in Adrian's transmitter, 14 names, the ones they had believed represented the full extent of the corruption's reach into federal systems, had not been a complete list. Adrian had known it wasn't complete. He had told Hargrove on the first day, quietly, while Elena was giving her statement. He had told her there were names he couldn't document, people he had identified by pattern and proximity, but could not connect to a paper trail. He had told her the 14 were the foundation, not the ceiling. Hargrove had not told Elena this until now. "Why are you telling me now?" Elena said. "Because one of the undocumented names," Hargrove said, "is someone in the VA's own regional oversight office, and the undersecretary's meeting Thursday, the one you confirmed for, I confirmed it yesterday. The person who called you to confirm it," Hargrove said carefully, "is not the undersecretary's actual administrative coordinator. We've verified the undersecretary's office did not place that call." Elena stood in her kitchen in the early morning, coffee cooling in her hand, the brace strapped on in its correct sequence, the morning light coming through the window above the sink. "Someone called me pretending to be the undersecretary's office," she said. "Yes. To set up a meeting. A meeting at a location they specified, in a building that is not VA property." Hargrove paused. "Elena, don't go Thursday." Elena set the coffee down. "Who made the call?" she said. Hargrove was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "We're still identifying the number," she said, "but the name the caller used, the coordinator's name they gave you, matches a person who retired from federal service 8 months ago." Another pause. "The same month as Darren Quill." Elena did not go Thursday. She did something harder than not going. She called the number back. She did it with Hargrove on a parallel line, recording, and with Mason sitting at her kitchen table with his coffee untouched, and his attention fully on her face. She had told them both what she was going to do, and neither of them had tried to stop her, which she appreciated. She had explained her reasoning clearly. The person on the other end of that call had her name, her phone number, and had already demonstrated the capability and willingness to impersonate federal officials. Disappearing from the meeting would not make that person stop. It would only make them recalibrate. She wanted them to stop. The phone rang 4 times. Then a voice, the same voice, measured and institutional, said, "Ms. Voss, we were hoping to hear from you." "I'm calling to confirm Thursday," Elena said. Her voice was steady in the way she had trained it to be steady over years of delivering difficult information to patients who needed the person telling them to be calm. "I have a conflict at the time you suggested. Can we move it to 10 in the morning?" A pause. Brief, but present. "That should be workable. Same location." "I'll need the address again. I didn't write it down properly." Another pause. Longer this time. The calculation on the other end of the line was audible in the silence. Not literally, but Elena could feel it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather arrives. "Of course," the voice said, and gave her an address in a commercial district on the east side of Harlow City. She thanked them. She hung up. Hargrove had the address traced within 6 minutes. The building was registered to a property management company that was a subsidiary of a holding entity that, when you followed its registration chain back through 3 layers of corporate structure, connected to the same Delwick County holding company that had moved Silver Meridian's diverted equipment money. The network had a physical location, and it had just told them where it was. "They think I'm coming Thursday at 10, Elena said. They think you're coming Thursday at 10, Hargrove confirmed. Then we have 2 days. What happened in those 2 days was not something Elena was present for in any operational sense. Hargrove's team worked with a federal task force that had been assembling since the warrant packages were processed, and the building on the east side of Harlow City became the focal point of a surveillance and entry operation that ran simultaneously with the continuing audit of Silver Meridian's records. Elena's role was to remain available for consultation and to not approach anywhere near the address she had given Hargrove. She worked her shifts. She checked in on her patients. She called Dominic every evening, and the conversations were increasingly normal. His knee was responding well to the physical therapy protocol. The lemongrass soup place had apparently added a new item to the menu that he felt she needed to know about, and he had taken to sending her news articles about the Silver Meridian investigation with a single-line commentary that ranged from, "Look at this," to "I told you these people were criminals," despite never having said anything of the sort. She slept badly, but slept. She ate. She strapped on the brace each morning in the sequence that was correct and let it do its job. On Thursday morning at 9:47, federal agents entered the building on the east side of Harlow City. They found 3 people inside, a former VA regional oversight officer named Callum Brigg, who was the undocumented name Hargrove had been tracking, a communications consultant who had made the phone call to Elena and whose previous employment included 3 years at Silver Meridian's public affairs office, and a woman named Delia Strom, who had retired from federal service the same month as Darren Quill, the same month as the fictitious coordinator whose name had been used on Elena's call, and who had, in the 8 months since her retirement, been the operational coordinator for the network's damage control efforts. Strom was the one who had identified which NCIS complaint to close. She was the one who had arranged Darren Quill's continued involvement after his retirement. She was the one who had, when the Vasker Falls situation escalated beyond what Croft could manage, made the decision to impersonate a federal office to draw Elena Voss into a controlled environment. She was 61 years old, with 32 years of federal service and 2 commendations on her record. And when the agents came through the door, she was sitting at a table with a cup of tea and a legal pad and the specific composure of someone who had spent decades in rooms where maintaining composure was a professional skill. She looked at the lead agent and said, "I'd like to call my attorney." "You have that right," the agent said. "I know," she said. "I wrote the guidelines." She was processed with the same procedural correctness that her composure seemed to expect, which was neither a reward nor a courtesy. It was simply how it was done. Her attorney arrived within the hour. The legal pad was logged into evidence. The tea went cold. Brigg, who had not maintained his composure, was significantly more verbal about his belief that the entire situation was a misunderstanding that would be resolved through proper context. He said this 4 times in different configurations before his attorney arrived and advised him to stop saying it. The agents had heard variations of this particular speech many times across many years in many rooms, and it did not affect their documentation. Elena received Hargrove's call at 11:20 while she was charting in the nursing station on the post-surgical floor. "It's done," Hargrove said. Elena set down her pen. "All 3? "All 3 in custody. Brigg is talking, which we expected. Strom is not, which we also expected." A pause. The task force found a secondary set of records in the building. Physical files, paper, not digital. Strom kept paper records of every arrangement, every coordination, every name involved at every level. We think she kept them as insurance. Against the people she was working with. "Against everyone," Hargrove said. "She built a network and then documented the network in enough detail to destroy it if anyone inside turned on her." A longer pause. "There are 19 additional names in those files. People we didn't know about. People who are going to spend the next several months talking to federal investigators." Elena looked at the nursing station whiteboard, at the patient names and their status indicators, and the medication schedule, and the dozen small logistical facts that kept 11 people moving through recovery. The ordinary machinery of a place that kept people alive. "Is Adrian's situation formally resolved?" she said. "His record? His discharge." "His record was corrected as of yesterday. The fraudulent discharge documentation has been voided, the TBI assessment resumed under a legitimate treating physician, and his status with Naval Special Warfare is reinstated pending medical clearance. He's working with a neurologist at Harlow Naval Medical." Hargrove paused. He asked me to tell you something. Tell me. He said, the brace worked better than I planned. He said you'd know what that meant. Elena did know. The brace had worked better than Adrian planned because it had done more than carry a transmitter to the right airport. It had fallen in a boarding lane and put a disabled woman on the floor in front of people who walked around her, and that event had generated a complaint and a documented record and a sequence of consequences that now sat inside a federal accessibility review process with enough weight to change how an airline managed mobility assistance requests for every passenger who came after her. The transmitter had been the plan. The fall had been the accident that became something else. She thanked Hargrove and went back to her charting. The public dimension of the story took on its own life in the weeks that followed, the way these things do, accelerating and then plateauing and then settling into the kind of sustained procedural coverage that doesn't have the energy of a breaking story, but is more honest about what accountability actually looks like. It looks like court dates and plea negotiations and audit findings and policy revision processes that take longer than anyone would prefer and produce documents that most people will never read. It looks like a 3-paragraph update buried in the middle of a federal oversight report. It looks like a form being changed. Elena gave 2 interviews. She had been asked for significantly more and declined all but 2, and the ones she agreed to were not the ones that wanted the most dramatic version of the story. She chose the one run by a veterans advocacy publication and the one run by a disability rights organization, both of which were interested in the specifics: the accessibility failure, the equipment diversion, the way that systems designed to help people with mobility limitations had been converted into machinery for exploiting them. Both publications had readers who would understand the specifics in ways that a general audience wouldn't, and Elena was not performing for a general audience. She was talking to the people the story was actually about. The Veterans Advocacy interview was published first, with a title that Elena had not suggested and found slightly too emphatic, but which she acknowledged accurately conveyed the situation. The disability rights interview was longer and more technical and included, at Elena's insistence, a detailed description of the accessibility failure at Vasker Falls as a parallel to the equipment fraud, 2 expressions of the same underlying logic, which was that people who needed assistance were manageable, deferrable, less urgent than the operational convenience of the systems around them. She said, in the second interview, the people who walked around me on that floor were not bad people. Most of them. They were people who had learned from 1,000 small signals over their lives that a disabled person in difficulty in a public space was someone else's problem, that learning didn't come from nowhere. It came from environments that consistently modeled that response. You change the response by changing the environment. That's not idealism. That's just how behavior works. The interviewer asked if she was angry. She said, I was angry for about 48 hours. Then I decided that anger without direction is just pain, and I've had enough pain to know it's not useful on its own. I directed it. The airline's protocol revision was finalized 8 weeks after Vasker Falls and implemented across all its regional hubs. The revision required a direct communication confirmation, not a system flag, but a verbal confirmation between the accessibility desk and the gate agent for every mobility assistance request, with documentation of that confirmation logged in the passenger's record before boarding commenced. It was not a complicated change. It was the kind of change that should have existed from the start, and the fact that it hadn't existed was not a mystery or an accident. It was the result of 1,000 small decisions made over years by people who were optimizing for operational efficiency rather than for the experience of people who needed more than the standard process provided. Elena submitted written testimony to the airline's review board and to the Transportation Authority's Accessibility Committee. She submitted it clearly and without heat, in the same precise language she used for clinical documentation. She described what had happened in sequence. She described what should have happened. She described the gap between those 2 things and what closing that gap would require. She did not characterize the employees as malicious. She characterized the system as inadequate. There is a difference, and the difference matters when you are trying to fix something rather than punish someone. She was not uninterested in the punishment of the people who deserved it. Those processes were underway and would reach their conclusions without her active participation. Veth had entered a plea. Quill was negotiating. Fenwick had retained a defense attorney who was apparently arguing that the treatment protocol constituted legitimate psychiatric care, which the licensing board was reviewing with the specific expression that licensing boards develop when a claim is technically arguable and morally indefensible. Brigg was cooperating in exchange for considerations he would never fully receive because the scope of what he had participated in outweighed whatever information he was providing. Strom remained silent, which was consistent with 32 years of professional habit, but the paper files she had kept as insurance were doing the talking for her with comprehensive precision. Croft received a federal charge and a public defender and a court date 6 months out. The secondary market broker who had moved the equipment through 3 states was identified, arrested, and found to have, in addition to the veterans' mobility devices, a storage facility containing medical equipment from 4 other sources, none of which he had obtained legally. He was considered a person of significant interest by 3 separate federal investigative bodies, which meant his legal situation was complicated in a way that would take years to fully resolve. None of it was fast. None of it was clean. The arc of accountability bent slowly and imperfectly, with delays and procedural frustrations and moments where the machinery seemed to stop and require someone to push it from outside. Elena pushed when pushing was her role and waited when waiting was. She was accustomed to the timeline of recovery. She knew that the things worth repairing did not repair quickly. 4 months after Vasquez Falls, the Undersecretary for Veterans Benefits, the actual one, whose office had been impersonated to set a trap, requested a meeting with Elena. The request came through verified channels, confirmed by Hargrove before Elena responded, and the location was the Undersecretary's actual office in the Regional Federal Building on Callaway Street, which Elena had verified using the public directory before confirming. She went on a Wednesday morning, taking the bus because it was easier on her leg than driving for 40 minutes, and arrived 11 minutes early because she was constitutionally incapable of arriving any other way. The Undersecretary was a woman named Rosalind Ober, in her late 50s, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in federal service and had long since stopped performing its formalities. She shook Elena's hand, looked at the brace the way someone looks at something that has context for them, and said, "Sit wherever's comfortable," which Elena noted was the first time anyone in an official capacity had said that to her without it being a rote customer service phrase. They talked for 90 minutes, not about the investigation that was being handled by people whose specific job it was, about the structural conditions that had allowed the investigation to be necessary, about the VA rehabilitation program infrastructure, about the gap between what the programs were designed to do and what they were doing in practice, about the accessibility failure at Vasquez Falls and what it represented beyond the specific incident. Obert listened the way experienced people listen, not waiting for a pause to respond, but actually receiving what was being said. She asked 3 questions in 90 minutes, all of them precise, none of them rhetorical. At the end of the meeting, she said, "I want to establish a patient experience advisory panel for the rehabilitation program review. People with direct experience of these systems, as patients, as clinicians, as both. I'd like you to chair it." Elena was quiet for a moment. "I work full-time," she said, 40 hours minimum, usually more. The panel meets monthly. The preparation is significant, but it's manageable alongside full-time work if the person doing it is organized. "I'm organized." "I know. I read your notebook documentation from the airport. A person who can produce that kind of record under those conditions is someone I want helping design how these systems are evaluated." Obert paused. "This is not a figurehead position. I want people who will tell me when something is wrong and who have the credibility and the specific knowledge to explain why." Elena thought about the 40 minutes at Gate 14B, about the form she had submitted to the airline's review board, about the second interview and the sentence she had said about behavior and environment, about Adrian in a locked ward for 8 months, holding on to a probability, about Dominic on a post-surgical couch eating lemongrass soup, furious on her behalf because he understood that the fury was useful and she had directed hers elsewhere, about the floor of the boarding lane and the passengers who walked around her and the teenager who had handed her the crutch without a word and put his headphones back on. An act of simple, uncomplicated helpfulness in the middle of an hour in which almost nobody else had managed it. "Yes," she said. "I'll chair it." Obert nodded. "Good. Then without preamble, I also want to formally acknowledge, on behalf of this office, that the rehabilitation program placed you in danger without your knowledge or consent. The equipment issued to you through VA-affiliated channels was compromised before it reached you. The institutional failure that allowed that is ours to account for. I wanted to say that to you directly, not in a letter." Elena received this without moving. There was something in the directness of it that she had not prepared for. Not the content, which she had known to be true, but the fact of someone in an official position saying it to her face without qualification or deflection. "Thank you," she said. "That matters. It should have been said sooner." "A lot of things should have been done sooner," Elena said. "But the starting point is where you are, not where you should have been." Obert looked at her for a moment. "Is that clinical training or personal philosophy?" "Both," Elena said. "They've stopped being separable." She left the federal building at 12:43, stood in the winter sunlight on Callaway Street for a moment, and called Mason. He answered on the second ring. She could hear Atlas in the background, not doing anything particular, just present, which was how Atlas seemed to move through most situations. "How'd it go?" he said. "I'm chairing an advisory panel for the VA rehabilitation program review." A pause. "Did you plan to do that when you went in there?" "No, but it makes sense." "It does." Another pause, shorter. "Adrian started his outpatient TBI sessions yesterday. The neurologist says his cognitive baseline is strong. The medication suppressed function. It didn't damage it. He's going to be okay." "I know," she said. "He called me." "He called you?" "Last week. He wanted to talk. We talked." She shifted the phone to her other ear. "He's not easy to talk to. He processes things by explaining them, which means the conversation is mostly him telling me why every decision he made was the most logical option available. But underneath that, She searched for the word. "He's still in there. Whatever they tried to do to him in that ward, they didn't get to the part that mattered." "No," Mason said. "They didn't." There was a silence between them that was comfortable rather than awkward, the kind that develops between people who have been through something together that doesn't have a clean category. "The panel starts in 6 weeks, Elena said. "I'll need someone who understands military rehabilitation program structure from the patient side. Someone who's been through it." "I know a few people," Mason said. "I thought you might." She took the bus home. It was a 40-minute ride, and she spent it looking out the window at the city moving past. The ordinary architecture of a Thursday afternoon. People on sidewalks and in cars, and coming out of buildings with coffee cups and bags of groceries, all of it proceeding with the unconcerned continuity of daily life. She had been part of this scene 100 times, and had not usually stopped to look at it. She looked at it now. She thought about something a supervisor had said to her in her second year of nursing training, a woman who had spent 30 years on a trauma floor and who had the specific quality of exhausted competence that Elena had been trying to understand since she was 22. The supervisor had said, "The thing nobody tells you is that most of what you do will never be recorded anywhere. The patient won't remember your name. The family won't know what you prevented. You will go home and the intervention you made will just be part of someone's recovery, and they'll attribute it to the doctor or to luck, and you will have to be okay with that. You have to find a way to find it enough." Elena had thought about that sentence on and off for years, holding it up to different lights. She thought about it now and found that it still held, but differently. It was still true that most of what she did was unrecorded and unremarked and absorbed into outcomes that other people claimed or that nobody claimed at all. It was still true that the work was mostly invisible, that the competence was assumed when it was present and scrutinized when something went wrong, that the systems in which she operated were built for efficiency rather than for the people moving through them. But she also thought, sometimes the notebook matters. Sometimes the thing you wrote down at 6:15 in the morning, because you had 8 years of reflex and no other tool available, becomes the thing that documents a system failure that a federal review board uses to change a protocol that will affect every person who comes after you. Sometimes the record you keep, because nobody is going to keep it for you, is the record that changes something. She did not think this made her remarkable. She thought it made the notebook remarkable, and the reflex behind it, and the years of being told that her experience was not the priority and deciding to document it anyway. She was not a person who had triumphed. She was a person who had been failed by multiple systems on the same morning and who had written it down and who was still writing. The bus stopped 2 blocks from her apartment. She got off, adjusted the crutch, and walked home in the cold December air, the brace calibrated and functioning. her hip carrying the faint residual ache of an injury that was healing at the pace injuries heal, which is not always the pace you want, but is the pace you get. She had physical therapy on Friday. She had a panel meeting in 6 weeks to prepare for. She had 3 patients to check in on tomorrow morning, including a veteran in room 7 who was 5 days post-surgery on a hip replacement and who had asked her yesterday, quietly, how long before he could walk without thinking about it. She had told him, a while, but you stop thinking about it eventually. It just becomes how you move. He had nodded as if this was the answer he had needed, and not the one he had been hoping for, which was the true answer to most things worth asking. She unlocked her apartment door, set her bag down, and stood in the hallway for a moment in the particular quiet of a space that was hers, just hers, ordinary and specific, with the crack in the kitchen ceiling she'd been meaning to have repaired, and the houseplant on the windowsill that was more persistent than it had any botanical right to be. She took off her jacket. She sat on the edge of the bed and worked the brace through its removal sequence, thigh cuff, then knee, then mid-shin, and set it in its stand by the nightstand the way she always did. She sat for a moment in the quiet. What she felt was not triumph, because triumph implied that the thing was over, and the thing was not over. Veth would stand before a judge. Strom's attorney would make arguments. The panel would have its first meeting and its first difficult conversation and its first moment where someone would say that what Elena was proposing was not practical, given the constraints of the current budget cycle. The airline would implement its revised protocol, and some employee somewhere would forget to follow it, and someone would have to document it again and push again. The work did not have an ending, it had stages. But there was something she felt, sitting in the quiet of her apartment in December, that she let herself feel without immediately categorizing it or putting it to work. It was the feeling of having been told, in many different ways and by many different mechanisms, that her experience was not the priority, and of having decided, methodically and without drama and one document at a time, that it was. Not because she was special, because she was there, because she had the notebook and the reflex and the particular stubbornness of a person who had spent years in environments that required her to be present and useful even when the conditions were working against her. She had been on the floor of a boarding lane at Vasker Falls International Airport. People had walked around her. One teenager had handed her the crutch without being asked, put his headphones back on, and returned to his seat. That teenager did not know that the crutch he handed back was the thing she used to lever herself into a position where she could reset the brace. He did not know that the reset was the thing that started the sequence. He did not know that the woman he had helped, with complete indifference and complete simplicity, was carrying 8 months of someone else's evidence and the documentation of her own mistreatment and the specific reflex of a person who writes things down. He had just seen someone who needed the thing in his reach, and he had handed it over. She thought about that, about how much of what matters is that simple and that unremarkable, about how the systems fail and the institutions disappoint and the people in charge of doing the right thing find reasons not to, and still, in the middle of it, a teenager hands you your crutch, and a dog finds what it was trained to find, and a man who has been in a locked ward for 8 months trusts that the world is large enough to eventually produce the right conditions. It is not a guarantee. It is a probability. Elena had been someone else's probability, and the probability had worked. She reached for the notebook on her nightstand, a new one, the old one, having become federal evidence, and opened to the first blank page. She had a panel to prepare for. She had a system to understand well enough to change. She had patients tomorrow morning, and a hip that was healing, and a brother who was going to send her another news article with a one-line commentary before she woke up. She began to write. Not for any record or any review board or any federal process, just because the reflex was there, and the reflex had turned out to be worth something, and she was not going to stop practicing it because the last time had cost her a bruised hip and a locked brace and 8 hours in an airport operations room. She wrote, "What the system gets wrong is the assumption that people who need assistance are the variable. They are not the variable. The system is the variable. People just live in it and make do." She looked at the sentence. It was not polished. It was not the kind of thing that looked good on a plaque. It was accurate. She kept writing.